कस्तूरितिलकं ललाटपटले वक्षस्थले कौस्तुभम् नासाग्रे वरमोतिकं करतले वेणुकरे च कङ्कणम् सर्वाङ्गे हरिचन्दनं सुललितं कण्ठे च मुक्तावली गोपस्त्री परिवेष्टितो विजयते श्रीगोपालचूडामणि. Pranam. Thank you, Professor Gaude, for those kind words. And I should thank Dr. Sumanta Rudra, who is a friend, and Professor Gaude, and all the other faculty members in this department for organizing this conference, which gives me an opportunity to listen to such stalwarts in the field like Ravi Gupta, Professor D'Souza, and all the others who are yet to come. So, actually, the previous sessions have put me into a tight spot. How to keep up to those standards created by Professor Gupta and Professor D'Souza. Let me assure you that I think all of us are feeling a bit sleepy with the sumptuous lunch by the courtesy of Department of Sanskrit and all the organizers. Let me tell you that I am feeling sleepy. I landed yesterday in the morning, I think, around 2:30. And after that prasad. One rider, I am going to talk about many things, as is customary to us, the scholars, and will mean nothing. So, be assured. I'll touch on many aspects of hermeneutics, Indian traditions, narrativity, iterability, such codified terms. So let's begin with this. Yes, please. Remembering this thing about reception, because my paper title says Receiving Dharma. Reception studies is a field which is closely related to reader response theory and also hermeneutics in a way. So we won't get into that theoretical thing, but reception studies in principle says that when something is getting translated into a target culture, target language, then the horizon of that target language or culture gets expanded. And not only that, the target language horizon also influences the text, the object that is coming into the scene. So it's not a one-way process. It kind of mutually influences both the thing that is coming, thing, text, concept, idea, song, anything, and also the target language horizon that is getting expanded through the process of translation or reception. So with that notion of reception in mind, we'll talk about receiving dharma. If you have read the abstract out of curiosity, you are already aware that I am going to talk about dharma and dharma grantha caught in an endless process of reinterpretation. Having said that, please note that this process is not a deviation. It is not an obstacle or a hurdle that has to be overcome in order to arrive at a definitive meaning of things, words, or concepts. Rather, it is the process of reinterpretation itself which constitutes dharma and also the Grantha. The process lends meaning to all of it, Dharma and Dharma Grantha. So, the process is Dharma. It is not a deviation, but it is Dharma. But we'll talk about that later. Before that, we need to decide how to speak of Dharma, which is thought of as experiential and esoteric to begin with, and which calls for a being evolved to a higher plane. How, without that presumed elevation, we can even attempt to talk about Dharma, especially when it has been said that the know-how is hidden inside a cave. Dharmasya tattvam nihitam guhayam. We all know this saying. How can we talk about that without getting into the caves? As if to give us respite from this foundational dilemma, the next line offers a leeway. Mahajano yena gatah sapantha. So there is still some hope for souls like us, located outside or at best at the peripheries of the experiential, to talk about things. Provided we follow the Mahajanas, the great beings, great souls, but that is only the beginning of our confusion. In the guise of a doorway, it is but another stumbling block. How to decide who is the Mahajan and how to follow the destined path. There are far too many Mahajanas and paths, that is, I have only one unsure, feeble existence. How do I choose? What will be the correct path for me? What if I happen to tread on one which leads astray, which does not lead me to the ultimate, to the goal post? What if? So, my troubled mind takes recourse to the books instead, the Grantha, and is shocked to discover similar ambiguities therein too. Which book? Which one to follow? Again, there are far too many. In fact, the preceding line of the verse quoted above from the Mahabharata and uttered by none other than Yudhishthira, who is known as Dharmaraj. He is speaking of Dharma and he is a Dharmaraj. So the previous line proclaims, I quote, the Shrutis are different from one another. There is not even one Rishi whose opinion can be accepted by all. Unquote. Really? Even the Rishis had their issues? Poor us. In this rigmarole, we find ourselves to be increasingly lost and sad. One qualifier. When I am speaking of Dharma in this article, I am using the word in a particular sense, probably the narrowest possible sense, to mean religion in an Abrahamic sense, being fully aware that Dharma may mean duty, righteousness, property, characteristic, among other things. But here we have assembled to talk about the religious and religious studies. Hence, this contraction of meaning is to be understood as a pragmatic choice. Further, the discourse of meaning will be more problematic and complex if all the senses of Dharma are to be taken into consideration. So, it is indeed a relief that we have restricted ourselves to the domain of religion equals to Dharma. Now, speaking of Abrahamic religions, it is common knowledge that all of them have otherworldly books, Asmani Kitab, which are central to their faiths and the doctrines. We are also aware that this is not the case of Dharma, where in spite of the existence of the Vedas, no one centralized book can be accorded that status. Yudhishthira himself admits that Shrutis, even the Vedas, differ from one another. That is why, if one has to understand Sanatana Dharma, and if she has to choose a text to begin with, the text in question can be the Vedas, Itihasas, Puranas, Sutras, Dohabali, or Hanuman Chalisa, or a televised Chota Bhim, or a film like Jai Santoshi Mata. Anything. It is true that there are elaborate hierarchies of texts in India. The higher ups and lower downs are almost absolutely codified. But still, One has the liberty to begin with any text she likes. When I am describing this ambiguity as a coveted freedom of choice, it should also be taken into account that this choice, besides granting liberty, also becomes a predicament. However, the fact remains that you can begin with any text, and the text you like or stumble upon or being forced to, the fact remains that you can begin with any text and it will remain a legitimate choice. In a postmodern vocabulary, it will work as your entry point to the maze that is your religious discourse. I repeat, only one entry point, and all the other entry points are democratically equal and valid. You might wonder why the Abrahamic religions are recurrently surfacing in this discussion, because hermeneutics, as have been laid out, which you have chosen as one of the key terms in your conference theme, perhaps the central one at that, owes its origin specifically to the followers of Abraham, to be more precise, the Judeo-Christian tradition of interpreting the book. In my abstract, I have also referred to our traditions of books. More on that later. But why hermeneutics came into being and at which point in history? That there is more than one potential and probable interpretation viable to the understanding of the same utterance, accepting that was not at all easy, especially in case of sacred speech. It needed certain momentum to achieve. Thinkers like Heidegger and Gadamer have been discussed here. I am not going to repeat all that. I just want to re-emphasize that the point of departure for the discipline of hermeneutics itself is grounded in biblical studies. Of course, the thinkers went far beyond, perhaps too far at times, but they had to begin with the given book. In my understanding, it was a great moment in the history of human thinking to accept multiple probabilities even in case of the sacred, the knowledge received from God. But its novelty has to be understood in the context of positivism in Europe. Positivism dominated its approaches to religion like all other facets of life. If we broaden the ambit and venture outside Europe and look into the Dharma traditions, the multiplicity was accepted from day one in our discourses. Without the privilege of being based solely on one book, which is always ordained and given, here multiplicity and plurality become the given. The book is not given, but multiplicity is the given. This is not only a complacent wordplay. My submission is simply, diversity is not a choice in case of India. It is a condition which pre-exists our discourses around diversity. In case of language, nationality, clothing, or food habit, we are aware of this diversity in our country, but we are yet to fully realize the potential of this diversity in case of Dharma equals to religion. I will go as far as to state that diversity is the only commonality to all our sects and faiths. Diversity is the only commonality to all our faiths. All is Dharma, yet they are diverse. Slightly changing that, I will say, all is Dharma because they are diverse. All is Dharma, yet they are diverse. Slightly changing that, I am trying to submit, all is Dharma because they are diverse. What is this umbrella of Dharma? Umbrella indeed. Otherwise, how can Astika Nastika, Nirguna Saguna, Sakara Nirakara, Shaiva, Shakta, Vaishnava, Ganapatya, Saura, Brahminical, egalitarian, Shastriya, Lokayata, all these dichotomies can be conceptualized within this one terminological category of Dharma. The Shruti itself says, Ekam sadavipra vahudha vadanti. Truth is one, the wise speaks it differently. So, we have a hermeneutic tradition that precedes the hermeneutic turn per se. At last, at least that which begins with thinkers like Dilthey and Heidegger. We all know that the interplay of the text and context, which has also been discussed as the hermeneutic circle, in effect, questions the predilection for meaning that is definite, aptly to be termed later as the metaphysics of presence. This was unique and unthinkable within the positivist analytical mindset, always fixated towards an essential connection between the signifier and the signified. A view beginning right from Aristotle, according to which interpretations can lead to either correct or incorrect meanings. Note this, either correct or incorrect. But is the world of meanings so neatly dividable? There is a large debate about this originary intention and the reader's intervention. It depends on the will of the reader. So, there can be goodwill and will that is not so. I'll come back to that, but see, for instance, the multiplicities of interpretation in Dharma. Let us take this shloka. Krishna Varnam Tisha Krishnam Sangopangastra Parshadam Yaggai Sankirtana Prayed Jajantihi Sumedhasah. The conventional interpretation of this verse from Srimad Bhagavad Puran says, in this age of Kali, people who are endowed with sufficient intelligence will worship the Krishna, the Dark One, who is accompanied by his different associates by performance of Sankirtana Yajna. However, the Goswamis of Vrindavan would employ this verse as a scriptural proof, Shastriya Pramana, to establish Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as an avatar. It would be done in a mesmerizing manner by slight variations of Anvaya. While Krishna Varnam was earlier interpreted as of dark complexion, taking Varnam meaning color, now Varnam would mean syllable. Krishna Varnam, that is, repeating the syllables Krishna. Therefore, it cannot be Krishna himself who is repeating Krishna. Again, in case of Tvisha Krishnam, the Vrindavan Goswamis would read it as Tvisha Yukta, not Krishnam. Tvisha Yukta Akrishnam. A legitimate reading, because in both cases Sandhi would produce the same letter A. But a brilliant move, because Akrishnam means not black, that is the opposite of black. Now it is only a small step to equate the opposite of Krishna with Gaura, which will signify both the complexion and name of Gauranga Mahaprabhu. Another name for Chaitanya. The question is, though the traditional reading and the reading by the Chaitanyites differ in principle, do they negate each other? Do they? Which one of these interpretations is wrong? And which one is definitive? The answer would be both and none. As they have separate contexts and resonances, therefore both are simultaneously legitimate. By this example, we realize the deep roots of diversity in our Dharma. Leave aside bigger and larger issues like differences of sects and doctrines, even something as small as nominal as a single verse can be interpreted multiply, and we have never actually denied the possibility of the other. Other thoughts, other sects, other faiths, other people. I am talking about this multifariousness of the Indian traditions, in the plural. Any attempts to regiment it around a centralized core or make it into a monolith is generically futile. We still begin with Purva Paksha. Our arguments always contain the arguments that are contrary to us, that are opposite. So, we have always accommodated the other within ourselves. I have almost come to the end of this because I am also feeling sleepy like you. But as you can guess, this is not an end, just a virama in the narrative, a caesura. I'll narrate one event of rupture from my experience and will stop. This is to get you out of the sleep mode, because narratives kind of kill sleep. But interestingly, this is also the final point that I want to make today. The issue of narrativity. People tend to take narratives a bit too casually. At least I do. It is understood simply as prose, a mistaken idea. Then again we take it as another name for genres like short stories and novels. I do that mistake. But I think you have clear idea about what narratives are. Just one point, quick point, absolutely for myself. In the Indian context, narratives can include almost anything. Some shrutis are narrative, itihasa, different types of kavya, folk songs. Anything might fall under the category or have something to do with narrativity. Another quick note, it is all about time. As our concept of time is circular, our narratives are also different from the narratives of the West. How circular? Just remember the voice of Harish Bhimani in the beginning of the Mahabharata serial. You remember that baritone voice, Main Samay Hoon. Yes, that is Samay. And you will understand what our time is. A wheel used to rotate and revolve on screen throughout the time of the voiceover. That is Samay. Circular. Without any beginning, middle or ending. That makes our narratives absolutely crazy to understand. Time moves back and forth all the while in the narrative. You think of Mahabharata, you think of Kadambari, anything. And it is another ball game to keep track of the narrators. Who is saying what? You will be super confused to decipher, to determine the narrator at a given point. Because there are embossed narratives, there are related episodic narratives. In the text Kadambari, curiously, the Marathi reception of novel, I think it's termed as Kadambari, right? Yes. So, that is very curious. When I tell this to my students in Bengal, they are really surprised that Kadambari can be the name of the genre when novel is being received within the Indian context. So, I think, you can better tell me, I think. In the Kadambari, the narrative structure is such that the first narrator begins with a story, then there are embossed narratives like Japanese dolls, and then at the end, the first narrator becomes a character within the story. So it's like a snake which is devouring itself. You cannot decide who is the narrator at any given point, some given points of time. So, another thing, because of this circular time, the juxtaposition of narratorial functions our narrativity becomes different from that of Europe, and it becomes confounding, almost amazing. You cannot sum up the story of Mahabharata or Kadambari unless you have to unfortunately sit for an exam. You cannot sum up, probably, the Mahabharata or Kadambari. If one has to know the story, she has to go through the narrative. She has to experience the narrative. Because it is not linear and it has a texture in itself. There is no plot which can be separated from the narrative style. The plot and the narrativity cannot be separated. If you take away the narrative, you are left with no plot as such. Therefore, narratives are something very integral to the core of the Indian literature, culture, and as Dharma is sculpted only within literature, with literature, narratives become integral to Dharma also. With this customary warning, now let me talk about my personal narrative. This experience is about the Grantha, which as a student of literature was fixed and given to me unless this thing happened. But before that, let me also submit that this experience can be deceiving, as memory generally is. Maybe this is a focalization point of many experiences happening and getting into myself over a longer period. Whatever be the case, I am narrating it as a climatic moment for the sake of my narrativity. Let's hear this. I was visiting the Maidan grounds at the heart of Kolkata. This is a place still left with some greenery, and therefore all sorts of people come here in the evenings for a stroll, especially on the weekends, Sundays. Parents come with their children, couples come for a rendezvous, the elderly for a health walk. The Maidan turns into a fairground replete with hawkers, magicians, jugglers, and whatnot. So, on that destined day, I noticed an elderly gentleman sitting under a tree with a book in front of him, facing 3 or 4 reluctant listeners, very reluctant. Some were sleeping, dozing off. Going closer, I noticed that he was reciting the Ramcharitmanas of Tulsidas. The Kathabachak, this is another key term. The Kathabachak was adorning Tilaka and was understandably a Brahmin, not from Bengal, but the northern parts of India, probably Bihar or UP. The audience also consisted of people from UP and Bihar, migrant laborers, rickshawalas, an occasional office goer maybe. But it was an austere setting, just under the canopy of the tree, without even a picture of Ram, Lakshman, Sita or Hanuman. He was just beginning to narrate the story of Rama's birth. Sunu subha katha bhavani Ramcharita manasa bimala katha bhushundi bakhani suna bihaganayaka garuda. This is also reflective about katha. How inside the text of Ramcharitmanas, katha is being narrated over and over again to narrators, sets of narrators and listeners who turn into narrators. Gradually, more people began to come and join the katha. The sun was setting and Ramji finally could not take his birth, and the pravachan ended with customary benedictions. I noticed then there were at least 100 people in the crowd, predominantly men, but a few women also. Mostly Hindi speaking, but also a few Bengalis among them. They ate the prasad they themselves have brought, greeted the Panditji, obviously known to them, and took their leave. I was surprised at first how people create their own spaces amidst a city. How they carry their religion and culture to foreign lands. I was awed with the realization that the whole event of Katha, of instituting the Ram Rajya, is taking place directly under the looming shadow of the Octaloni monument, which was erected as the colonizers' victory monument, reminding forever the colonial past and the changes it ensued in our cultural texture, the ruptures, the paradigmatic shifts. And yet, the Katha continues to unfurl with an apparent nonchalance to the colonial and post-colonial conditions. Apparent. That was the moment when I realized that the narratives of our traditions have an immense power to withstand, assimilate, appropriate the temporal conditions, vicissitudes. Afterwards, be it in a remote village shrine or a soaring pandal, I have witnessed the katha, time and again. The role of a book is central to any katha, mostly Bhagavad Puran, Gita, Ramayana, Mahabharata, in Sanskrit, Bangla, Tamil, Kannada, Hindi, Marathi, and so on. But I have noticed that the book is seldom being referred to in any katha. The charm of the kathabachak or kathakar or kathak or pravachak lies at the fact that he is not bookish. He is not just reading aloud the book, because that has a separate name that is called Parayana. And Parayanas are not attended by people except for ritualistic purposes. Whereas the Katha has a tremendous popular appeal. I think now it's $1 million industry even. We'll refer to the lexicon of that Grantha, which is not being referred to here. I'll just finish in a few minutes. See, Grantha, as you will be knowing better than me, that Grantha may mean many things. It means tying, binding, stringing together. It means a knot. It can mean a honeycomb, an artificial arrangement of words, verse, composition, treatise, literary production, book in prose or verse, text, etc., etc. It can also mean wealth or property in the Jainistic traditions. But both Grantha and Sutra share the same originary story. Both words are derived from the practice of using strings, which were used to bind the manuscript folios together. In that sense, a Grantha is something which is binding and that which has been bound. So Grantha originally is not a book, but a thread running through the disjoint pages of a book. A connection necessary to hold the book together, making it, to give them a meaning and identity. If another version of the same Grantha is bound differently, that is, if the Granthan is different, we will get a separate book. Its function is similar to that of a thread in making a garland. Permutation and combination of the flowers will create n number of possible garlands. This is not only about the etymology of the word, but the concept that is denoted by the word, a concept that still somehow accompanies the employment of that word. Here, you do not have a metaphysics of meaning, rather creating possibilities of meaning which are all operative and latent and legitimate in the arrangement. When we hear death of the author, we think, but who is the author? Because here, the biographical figure of the author was never important. It acted much like what has been termed as author function in recent times. I find resonances of the idea of iterability in the simultaneity of narrative possibilities. The Grantha as only a possibility which can be uttered in any manner. For example, even if the same story from the same Grantha is uttered in two contexts, they will signify different things. I would not get into that complicated Derridian world, but would like to take a moment here to note the close parallels that we are getting to the idea of parampara. But I think there is a paper on parampara, so I'll rest here. So, to conclude, in the entire oeuvre of Dharma, the sacred, the profane, rituals, faiths, deities, trees, stones, rivers, places, stories, literary themes, genres, styles, metaphors, narratives, whatnot. In the entire repertoire of Dharma, we will have an idea of the supreme power of difference. Difference as the motivator and maker of the traditions. Through difference we continue to live, our traditions do, and so do our Granthas. The book or Grantha is like point of reference. It will be fully sculpted only when placed in relation to other texts, anecdotes, songs, personal stories, and what not. The Grantha, now in the print culture, can be easily accessed. But its true meaning can only be understood when you reiterate, when you digress from the point in hand. Only by becoming unfaithful to the text, you can practice your faith to the text. Let me end this by borrowing a Marathi saying. Apologies for my pronunciation. Granthachi Grantantara Tika. Is that correct? We have to bear this basic premise in our minds while envisioning the discipline of religious studies in this land of differences. To me, the would-be scholar of religious studies in India would be someone who is open to any possibilities, discourses, who is located to begin with in any of the strands of Indian traditions, but she is in a relentless search for resonances, similarities, and also differences. She is opening her mind and herself to the complex of literature, culture, archaeology, history, sculpture, music, and so on. All that constitutes Dharma, and in the process also get constituted by Dharma. Though she begins with the study of religion, she remembers the tremendous diversity and potential of Dharma. That is the hermeneutics we need. Ideally, she should be engaged in a productive process of looking for ways to understand the autonomies and interventions integral to the complexes of religions, cultures, which intermingle to create beautiful matrices for Dharma to thrive. And along with that, they create matrices also for people who are the most important factors in question here, the people who dwells inside Dharma, or may I say, the peoples. The sloka from Mahabharata quoted above was uttered by Yudhishthir in response to a question by Dharma personified in the guise of a crane. So the question was asked by Dharma himself. Dharma asks, just imagine the imagination of the author. Dharma is asking what is the path to Dharmaraj. He asks what is the path. And we have been discussing Yudhishthir's answers to this question all this while. In essence, it says that there is more than one path. Unless we walk the path is untrodden. So, let's have walks, long and short, maybe together, or maybe in opposite directions, whatever. Walking the path, becoming a part of the path, and by that, making the path is what matters. Thank you.
Very eloquent eloquent and literary presentation. It was beautiful not just in content but also in the manner of your language and presentation. I was thinking that we've been speaking so much about multiplicity of interpretation. I spoke about it, Professor D'Souza spoke about it. And when every profession has its occupational hazards, as I think someone said here, and I think one of the hazards of hermeneutics is that the multiplicity can become so vast as to make us ungrounded, to destabilize where we stand, where we don't know what is truth and what can we stand upon, because everything is constantly shifting. And I think in your presentation you provided a wonderful antidote to that problem by reassuring us that that multiplicity itself maybe is the solid ground upon which we can stand. That we do not have to fear that multiplicity, but rather we can embrace it. And I remember Diana Eck, she's a professor of, professor of religious studies at Harvard, written many wonderful books. In one short book called Darshan, it's now in its third edition, she talks about how, painting with broad strokes, she says how the Abrahamic traditions are convinced that in all matters of importance, as something gets more and more important, the fewer and fewer in number there will be, so that at the very top there will be one. And she says in the Hindu worldview, the perspective that she's calling darshan, it is the Hindu traditions are convinced that in matters of importance there will be more and more. That the more something becomes important, the more multiple it becomes. Right? So I was reminded of that quote as you were speaking about multiplicity. That I appreciated very much. How you said the process of reinterpretation is itself dharma. It's not that despite the multiplicity there we can find dharma, but because of that multiplicity we can find it. When you mentioned the nested narratives, I was thinking of how in my work on translating the Bhagavata Purana, I think I counted the maximum nested narratives at 7 or 8. So it was at one point in the Bhagavata, it is he says, that she says, that he says, up to the 8th level. And the more you have it, the more that truth can be trusted. Essentially, that's the idea, that the multiplicity of narratives makes it not more confusing, but more trustworthy. And I think that's the beauty of Sanskrit exegesis. That simple phrase, athava, that commentators again and again and again, they'll present an interpretation that the reader feels this must be the truth. And then the commentator himself will subvert that by saying athava, and what you took as the truth now is not contradicted, but supplemented by something that is very different, and yet can still be held in coexistence with that. So thank you for bringing that insight.